Every angel is terrifying. So Rilke tells us in his first Duino elegy, or in the stunning translation William H. Gass published in his late book, Reading Rilke. Every angel is awesome. From a certain angle, it's hard to think of a more spectacularly inapposite metaphor for Professor Gass than the angel, that pallid and milk-mild figure who watches over our graveyards and shows up around Christmas time to commit miracles on TV movies. In print, Gass was always a gleeful scourge of cant and fuzzy thinking, not to mention a mischief maker par excellence. And his cinematic tastes, at least according to my dear friend Naomi Lebowitz, I'm not even sure if this is true, ran more to Charles Bronson than to Jimmy Stewart. Is that true? Don't know. But I've been asked to talk about him in my capacity as a former student. And if, like me, you were a young person arriving at Washington University in the late 90s with a head full of literary ambitions, Bill Gass really did seem like one of those Rilkean angels, the supreme and scary avatar of the life of the mind. My first semester on campus, I knew him only as a kind of rumor, a hovering eminence. I didn't see him on the quad, but he was said to be somewhere nearby, in the halls of the philosophy department, or buying groceries at the Schnucks. Then, winter break of my freshman year, I picked up Omensetter's Luck and In the Heart of the Country. As I remember it, I read them in a kind of delirium over 2 consecutive nights spent lolling in a bathtub whose creeping tepidity I hardly noticed. Such are the pleasures and astonishments of freshman life. For here was a writer of the kind of fiction I adored, the maker of paragraphs as great as Faulkner's, only alive and nearby. If I retained any doubts about Professor Gass's literary stature, they were dispelled by seeing him stand up in Graham Chapel the following spring and read one of the death camp scenes from his masterpiece, The Tunnel. Entirely and perhaps uniquely appropriate to its subject, it is one of the saddest things I've ever heard. It is also, paradoxically, one of the most playful and the most beautiful. I then began to notice that at intervals, some other writer who makes these kinds of demands, a Lydia Davis, a David Foster Wallace, a Derek Walcott, would appear locally under the auspices of WashU's International Writers Center. I learned to make the trek to West Campus, even if I'd never heard of the author. Really, you went as much for Professor Gass's introductions as for the readings themselves. What was it like? I find myself reaching here for another metaphor the author of Middle C would have abhorred. Listening to Bill Gass give an introduction was like seeing Hendrix open for The Who. The spring of my sophomore year, I enrolled in the last class Professor Gass taught here. The subject was the philosophy of literature, and I didn't know quite what to expect, for in his writing, Gass liked to present himself, comically, as a reluctant and somewhat curmudgeonly teacher beset by the kind of undergraduate who, thinks Hendrix and Rilke belong in the same piece of writing. When asked why he didn't teach a fiction workshop instead, he used to say something like, well, at least when you're teaching them philosophy, you get to read Plato. But then on our first day of class, he handed out this. It's an approximately 10,000-word annotation on the complete work of Marianne Moore, which he had made personally for our delectation. I don't think it's ever been published. It is purely an act of generosity. And that spirit of generosity of thought, of spirit, and of presence, did not let up for the entire semester as Gass stood before us and talked eloquently and brilliantly and above all lovingly of Miss Moore and Elizabeth Bishop and Catherine Ann Porter. Sometimes what you're doing when you teach is imparting knowledge, But mostly what you're doing is modeling a habit of mind, a way of being in the world. And in his classroom work, his stewardship of the Writers' Center, and in his fiction and essays, Bill Gass was an unflagging inspiration. The last time I saw him, I was a senior on the last day of my internship at the International Writers' Center. I went into his office there, unsure whether he even really knew who I was, and found he'd prepared a set of his books inscribed as a parting gift. I mean, all of his books. That's a lot of books to inscribe, and also, I should add, a lot to schlep back from West Campus on the shuttle. What has ended up meaning even more to me, though, as a writer, was his posture when I walked in. I remember him leaning forward over his desk, fully immersed, poring over whatever book he was writing or writing about at the time, like his eyes could burn holes through the pages. He didn't even hear me come in. That's how I'd hope to be at 77. I don't think it's too much to call this Professor Gass's great lesson as a teacher. Not the many little things he told his students, but the one big thing he showed us, that his kind of seriousness, his kind of intensity, his kind of literary generosity were not historical objects to be admired, but actual present tense possibilities. Oh, and also this, the one-liner every angel gets at one point or another, be not afraid. Or rather, the Rilkean version, be afraid and then go do it anyway. Bill Gass's brilliance remained for me when I left his office that day a little terrifying. But I had come to understand that as a corollary to the beauty of really writing, really teaching, really living, by which I guess I simply mean to say this in the end, he was awesome. Every angel is.